Well, it is a great pleasure and it is an honor for me to stand in front of those that I consider the leaders of tomorrow. And I'm truly humbled by an opportunity given me by this beautiful institution and by an opportunity given to me by the rest of the parents that are here with us and my colleagues, and I am humbled and that I've been, since I've arrived in this province, I've been in capable hands of my good friends, Bernadette and Robin, and Rob and Eleanor, who have played a significant role in making sure that my tour here is a success. So I'm truly humbled and I'll forever be indebted to the contribution that they've given in this tour. And I would like to particularly recognize the presence of what seems to be something closer to home. I see a lady at the back who is wearing one of the attires, traditional attires. If it was summer, I would have dressed in my Xhosa traditional attire as she has done today as well. So I recognize her. That means that wherever I am, I find my people. And I would like to also say, you too, all of you in this audience, you are my people. For we are all the citizens of the world. Thank you, Mama. Siyabulela Mandela. When I was asked on what I would prefer, I'm not so, okay, I think I have an idea. So when I was asked on what I would prefer in terms of my presentation, and I have requested that I'm more interested in having a conversation with the leaders of tomorrow without me talking too much, but hearing more from my fellow leaders of tomorrow. But I saw it fit and necessary for me to perhaps give some context into the conversation that we'll be having today. And maybe if I give you a synopsis as of what motivates me and drives me to continue the work that we are currently engaged in this particular province and beyond. First and foremost, I'm he who has taken interest and who has saw it fit to continue the legacy of my great-grandfather, whom I call Comrade Nelson Mandela. I call him Comrade Nelson Mandela for I myself am a comrade. So outside the fences of the house of Mandela, he ceases to be my great-grandfather, but he begins to be Comrade Madiba. So I'll call him Comrade Madiba if you allow me. And Madiba and his generation played a significant role in waging a struggle against the apartheid regime in South Africa. And the apartheid regime in South Africa began at the time, for those who have read history or those who are disciples of history. In South Africa, it was in 1652 when a fellow coming from England and Britain by the name Jan van Riebeeck laid his foot in the shores of our own land, that is the then what was called the Cape of Good Hope. He landed in the Cape of Good Hope in 1652 with an attempt to go to India. In their journey, they were going to go to India to fetch spices. And upon arriving to our shores, they saw our land and saw it fit to take over the land from the indigenous people of South Africa to a barrel of a gun. For us, that was the beginning of colonialism. And as time progressed, then we saw legions of the British government and British soldiers entering into our shores and taking the land of our people by force. And if I am to give you a synopsis without boring you with the events of the past, I would say one of the most critical landmarks was the date of 1913, which saw the passing of 1913 Land Act, where 87% of our land was taken away from the indigenous people, which is the majority of South Africans. And it was then when our people decided to come together under the banner of a political organization called the African Native Congress, which was later called the African National Congress. And they came together and they waged a non-violent struggle against the colonial regime led by the British government. So South Africa, since 1652 until 1945, was colonized by the then called the Great Britain. And they've committed a lot of atrocities, and they've murdered and killed and raped and stolen the land of our people. It was only in 1945 when the Dutch won the elections, and the Dutch and the English in South Africa have always been at loggerheads over who should rule the native land. And in 1945, the Dutch people took over the reins of power from the British, called the English, and they now introduced even a more evil system than colonialism, a more evil system than segregation, which was called the apartheid regime. During the apartheid regime, things were even worse than under the British rule, and they did so in their attempt to form what they called Afrikaner nationalism. And it was through the apartheid regime where majority, if not all, black people in South Africa suffered the injustices of that particular system. A lot of people were killed, a lot of people were sent in prison, and there were laws that were solely directed toward segregating the South Africans. And the people of South Africa were divided into different groups, and some were sent in what was called then the homelands. And the homeland that I come from is the former Transkei. That is where Madiba came from, which is now the Eastern Cape. And Madiba and his generation in the late 1960s realized that the non-violent struggle that they waged against the apartheid regime was not bearing the fruits that they've been expecting. So probably you would say 50 or 60 years later, they realized that they will not be able to win or liberate their own people if they continue on the using non-violent methods to wage a struggle against a regime that was using violence and force against the people of South Africa. So they adopted a policy, a different strategy, which they called the Mandela Plan, for those who have studied history. And the Mandela Plan has had strategies and tactics which were more violent than the non-violent approach that they used to wage the struggle. But unfortunately, Mandela, who then started a military wing of the African National Congress called Umkhonto Wesizwe, or the Spear of the Nation, was arrested upon his return from traveling the outside world, mobilizing resources and mobilizing governments in Africa to support the military struggle and military wing of the African National Congress, which sought to liberate the oppressed people of South Africa. So it was then that upon his return in the late 1960s that Nelson Mandela was arrested. But the struggle continued, for it was not Mandela alone who was part and parcel of the struggle. There was a women's league that was part and parcel of the struggle. There was a youth league, and there were all other civil organizations. Organized labor was part and parcel of the liberation against our regime. They continued the struggle, and they continued to even call for the release of Nelson Mandela and the rest of the African National Congress and other leaders of different organizations that were arrested by that particular regime. And it was only in 11 February 1990 that Madiba was released from prison. And immediately when he was released from prison, he started what became known as the CODESA, which is the Congress for Democratic South Africa, which was a negotiation process whose attempt was to usher us from an apartheid regime to a new democratic dispensation, which was only realized in 27 April 1994. South Africa was then declared a democratic country led by the first black president, Comrade Madiba, under the government called the Government of National Unity, where forces of the opposition, those previous leaders of the apartheid regime, came together with the new leaders of the African National Congress and different organizations that were part and parcel of the negotiation process to then usher us into a transition process from apartheid to a new democratic dispensation. And part and parcel of that was the Truth and the Reconciliation Commission, which was designed to find ways to heal the nation and reconcile the people of South Africa. And upon that reconciliation, what was anticipated is that South Africa is going to be able to move forward as a rainbow nation, to move forward as a diverse nation. So central to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a need for forgiveness, was a need to relook at our past and relook and interrogate the injustices that were committed during the apartheid regime, and have an open dialogue about such injustices. From there, you giving those who were victims of that particular evil system an opportunity to heal and an opportunity to find closure. And upon healing and finding closure, you are able to reconcile both the victims and the perpetrators of that particular regime, and were then ushered to this new democratic dispensation. But critical to such, therefore, was a need to make sure that we speak a new language as a country. And that language was to say, ours is a rainbow nation, for our country is made up of different groups of people, both white, black, Indian, colored, and you can name all groups. The Jews were even part and parcel of the South African community. And ours was to say, as diverse as we are, we see ourselves as a rainbow nation. And we saw an emergence of this new language, that within our diversity, there is strength. And the focus was to say, no matter how different we look, no matter of the challenges that we face as a result of our differences, it is critical not to look at those things that divide us, but to say within our diversity, there is indeed a strength. So I took it then upon myself to continue the legacy of Madiba in making sure that we always find way to reconcile divided communities. So what I'm going to look at this moment is to introduce to you one of the probably two maps of Africa and give you a brief synopsis of the colonial history of Africa and one of the reasons why Africa is in a state that it is in this day. And I will briefly go through to some, and if you look, I don't know whether you are able to look at the map. If you look at the map and the yellow part of the continent, that is the colonization map of Africa. When the colonial powers looked at Africa, they said the top part of Africa is a healthy area to which the colonial powers such as France, Belgium, Britain, Italy, to a less extent, the Portuguese, the Germans, could be able to exploit as much resources as possible. That area, they said, it's fair to colonize, but we cannot get as much resources in that particular area. And when they looked down, which is in the southern part of Africa, that is where South Africa is part and parcel, Mozambique, Namibia, Tanzania, they saw that area and said, that is the most important part of Africa where we are going to be able to exploit as much resources as we are able to do so. And I would assume that this map was presented in what became known as the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1845. The Berlin Conference was held to what became known as the scramble for Africa. What happened in that particular meeting? All colonial powers sat down and said, we are going to divide Africa among ourselves. And upon dividing Africa, what they did, they then looked at our continent and imposed borders. They imposed borders upon Africa to say, this area is now going to be called South Africa. If you see the bold borders, the bold lines, shows the colonial borders that were imposed by those who wanted and those who exploited Africa. And the little lines that are not bold, those were communities, those were tribes that existed in Africa before colonization. And when they began to colonize us, they draw their own borders and they divided groups that were previously living and existing in one space in a state of harmony. And they divided those groups. That is why today Africa is in a state that it is in. And if you look in that, particular region, that is what they call the Great Lake region. In the Great Lake region, you are going to find a situation where in Burundi, where in Rwanda, where in Central African Republic, where in Democratic Republic of Congo, you find two dominant ethnic groups, the Hutus and the Tutsis. They are all found within that particular region, but they are divided among those four countries. They call that region the Great Lake region. And that region is currently embroiled in a vicious cycle of violence as a result of those borders that were imposed upon that particular community. That is why when the Belgians decided to colonize countries like Rwanda, they came and divided two ethnic groups that were previously living in coexistence, and they surveyed the land and realized and decided that the Tutsis should be elevated into a higher status than the Hutus, because they said the Tutsis resembled a character of a European species. And when they looked at them and they looked at their intelligence, according to them, They said Tutsis look more like Europeans. So what we're going to do, we're going to apply a policy of divide and rule. We're going to side with the Tutsis, elevate them into a higher status, and use the Tutsis to exploit the Hutus. And that has led to what became known as the Rwandan genocide of 1994, where within a period of 100 years, almost 1 million Tutsis were murdered by the Hutus to what was labeled as an act of vengeance for the injustices that the Tutsis did under the Belgian rule. So those are some of the challenges that you'll find in a lot of African countries. And if you come down south, the British used the similar policy of divide and rule. What they did was to say, we're going to look at those groups within the South African community, in particular the whites, English. We're going to divide them, we're going to segregate them. And they divided people according to race, black and white. And in 1994, when the Dutch arrived, they sided with the white and they divided the South African community to white, colored, Indians, and black. And they exploited those divisions, and that led to the racial conflict that we experience in the country, even during the time of apartheid, and to a lesser extent, even during the time of Madiba, and even in our lifetime. We experienced the remnants of the colonial era in South Africa. We experienced the remnants of the apartheid regime. So the most critical thing here is, as this generation, we have a collective responsibility to interrogate the injustices of our past, to look at our past and say, not in our name. And that is to say, even though they've used such terms as a race to divide us as a human race, it is our collective responsibility to say we are not going to allow our leaders to sow divisions within our community. Ours to say we need to come together, we need to reconcile, from our differences, we need to forgive the injustices of our past. We need to build bridges between the divided communities and start speaking a different language. And that will be the language that there is strength in our diversity. And that will be the language that we have to advance an agenda for peace, an agenda for reconciliation, and an agenda to defend and advocate for the rights of all those who live in this world. And we need to begin speaking the language that we see ourselves not through the color of our skin, but we see ourselves as the citizens of this world, as a one human race. And we need to come together united. For I have heard that each generation has its own purpose. We either fulfill it or betray it with relative propensity. That is what Frantz Fanon would say. So it is our responsibility as just this generation, for we are indeed the leaders of tomorrow. And whenever we see the injustices, raises its ugly head, whenever we see racism raises its ugly head, we must speak against such injustice. When now our leaders are speaking a new language, sentiments of anti-immigration, talking about building walls, talking about closing our borders, we must speak against such injustices, for they are steering us towards an adversarial path. And we've seen throughout history the consequences of taking that route. That route led to what became as the Jewish Holocaust, when Hitler murdered in mass numbers millions upon millions of the Jewish community, all because of his lunatic interest of creating what he called a more human race, or a pure race, or an Aryan race. And we've seen such injustices that were done by the colonial powers in Africa and elsewhere in the world. And we've seen the consequences, the evil consequences of the apartheid regime in South Africa. And you are currently seeing the injustices that are being committed by the Israeli state, what we call the Israel apartheid against the people of Palestine. And we must speak against such injustices, for there is so much to gain when we come together, and there's a lot to lose when we are divided. So that is the message that I'm currently I'm going to engage you on, and that is the legacy of Madiba. And I want to say to you, the generation before us waged their own struggle, and through waging such struggles, they've left and they've built a foundation upon which we are now enjoying the freedoms that we are enjoying. They fought for such freedoms. The leaders in the likes of Martin Luther King, through his civil rights movement, the leaders in the likes of Mahatma Gandhi in India, the likes of Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Steve Biko, Winnie Mandela in South Africa, the likes of Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, they have fought their own struggle, and they have created and they've left us with the foundation to which we can either break it or build upon that foundation. And the central question I want us to ask ourselves, what is our mission as this generation, and what are we going to do in making sure that we create this, we make this world a better place for all? And I would like to take it back to the audience and let us have a dialogue and a conversation about how do we make this world a better place for all. Thank you very much.
Remember, he prefers to be called Madiba. Thank you very much. Very stirring. I would like to ask the first question, because the names you were mentioning, Steve Biko, Thabo Mbeki, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, these are young people. What can a single individual, a young person, do to affect change?
Well, the generation before us waged their own struggle, and they didn't wage them as individuals. They waged those struggles as a collective. If you have heard when I kept mentioning Madiba, I said Madiba and his own generation. That is to say, if we are to effect change, you ought to identify like-minded individuals to whom you can join hands and wage a struggle against the injustices that you see in your communities. It is only when we come together as a collective that we are going to have a positive impact in our communities. As an individual, you would never be able to achieve what the collective would achieve. It will take you hundreds of years if you want to wage such struggle as an individual. But if you come together as a collective, we'll be able to wage the struggle against any injustices that we see in our community.
We have some microphones in the audience. So if there's any students who have a question, stand up, let your voice be heard, and ask Madiba what's on your mind, or a question you would have.
Or even comments.
Even comments.
You can disagree and agree. It's a dialogue. Yes, sir.
Shout it out, Sandy.
Hey, just with the I guess people expect. Is it like, is it hard living up to the name? That's just a great question.
Well, you can only imagine. Madiba has left big shoes, which are very difficult to fill. But each and every individual has a responsibility to contribute positively in our community. Whether you are carrying the name Mandela or you are not, you have a responsibility. Before he was the man that we know today, he was probably not known anywhere else except his village. But he saw it fit to speak against the injustices. And throughout that process, it was actually the people of South Africa and the world that made Mandela to be the name that it is today. And I'm sure even Madiba himself finds it difficult to understand why people held him at such a high esteem. For he always argued it was through a collective abilities, and it was through the sacrifices that were made by selfless men and women in our community that made our struggle to be at the level in which it was in. So yes, it is a difficult thing, a difficult legacy to carry, but I am only taking what I can as I forge my own path as an individual. I hope I've done justice to that question. It's a very difficult one.
Henry, stand up.
Hi, Mr. Rwanda. First of all, thank you for coming to Rochdale School. We all thank for that opportunity to. And Africa is actually a massive continent, and I was wondering what are some representatives that been carried on through the past. As you said, like the racism, the all sorts of the obstacles you have been faced. Of course, as your family Rwanda did some significant things. Can you provide some examples, please?
You're asking a question, Henry, and you need to slow down. That's okay. I think Henry was talking about maybe current problems that you see in Africa, that it is a large place. We tend to associate one thing happening in Africa is happening everywhere. Africa is an enormous continent. It's 4 or 5 times the size of North America. It's massive. One problem one where is not a problem everywhere. So are there current hotspots in Africa that we should be aware of, and are they following your focus of conflict resolution?
No. Thank you. Now I can fully understand that question. Let us first have a consensus and an agreement that Africa is not a country, but a continent. I come from South Africa, which is located at the southern African region of Africa. This is the Southern African region that is called SADC, if you abbreviate. And then that part is called West Africa. That's where you're going to find countries like Sierra Leone, countries like Ghana, and then here you're going to find countries like Libya. Your Egypt is up there north, and then you're going to find countries in the east, and then you're going to find countries in the Great Lake region. And then here you find what they call Mauritius, that is still part and parcel of Africa. I will clear about that. So Africa as a continent is currently characterized by chronic, violent conflict and underdevelopment. However, that does not mean there isn't much that is happening in South Africa, or that there is nothing good happening in South Africa. In Africa, I mean. In South Africa, for example, we are currently enjoying democracy. But within our democracy, just like any other country, we have a lot of challenges. For instance, something closer to my heart is a 36% unemployment rate that we're currently experiencing in our country as a result of the slow growth in our economy. And obviously, one of the things that are affecting the South African country, and which is something that is so prevalent in the rest of different countries in Africa, is a tendency among our leaders to be very greedy and very corrupt. Those are some of the challenges that currently bedevil the African continent. And obviously, a lot of conflicts are currently happening, conflicts and instability. In Zimbabwe, for instance, they have a serious recession that is currently happening, with majority of the population in that particular country being trapped in a dire state of poverty as a result of how corrupt their leaders are and some of the system that they've chosen. The countries that I'm currently focusing on, in particular Democratic Republic of Congo, is currently bedeviled by a vicious cycle of violent conflicts, especially the eastern part of that particular country. Nigeria is also affected with a lot of violent conflict, especially the northern part of Nigeria, where Boko Haram forces are. And I'm sure you've heard in the year or two of incidences where Boko Haram went into a school like this one, you'd assume a school, and taken more than 200 girls, and they left with them into the bushes in the northern part of the country. And that led to a movement called Bring Back Our Girls. That is the rebel group such as Boko Haram that has taken more than 200 women, and no one knows what they are doing. Some have returned up until this day. So those are some of the challenges currently as a result of the intervention by a former colonial power, France, under the auspices of North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. They invaded Libya and removed Gaddafi as the leader of Libya. Libya used to be one of the leading countries economically in Africa, but today, as a result of the injustices caused by Libya, caused by France, all in the name of saying we want a democracy, we want to impose democracy in Libya. The people of Libya are suffering under the leadership of Gaddafi. They removed Gaddafi, and that country dissolved in a state of chaos that it is in today. And there are such things as slavery that is currently happening in Libya today. So there's quite a lot of challenges. And just as early as recently, which is about 2 weeks, if not 3 weeks ago, countries like Mozambique were affected by what became known as tropical cyclone Idea, where hundreds of people perished during that tropical cyclone and lost their homes. And thanks to the humanitarian intervention of countries like Canada, a week ago, Canada sent some humanitarian intervention in Mozambique to assist those families that have suffered, and even in Zimbabwe as well. And there were threats of the outbreak of cholera as a result of that tropical cyclone. So there's quite a lot of challenges, just as within the health sector. I have heard about the effects of Ebola in West Africa. So those are some of the challenges that affect Africa. There are many more that have been highlighted. Yes, we have a question. Yes. Okay.
Patrick, just over here.
Besides the fact that you're Nelson Mandela's grandson, what else inspired you to do what you do?
Great grandson.
Oh, great grandson.
Well, what inspires me to do what I'm doing is because of the history of my country and the history of my continent. As a young person, I sit and wonder how and what happened to a human race when one person commits such injustices against the other. What happens in their consciousness? What kind of sicknesses are they possessed in? What kind of demons that are they possessed in that they will commit such evil acts and such injustices? So when I look at the history of our past and what the white people have done to the majority of South Africans, and I look at the resilience, the spirit of resilience and forgiveness that I've seen from our leaders who have played a significant role in ushering us to the new dispensation, democratic dispensation. And I still said to myself, it can not be that we will see again the emergence of such injustices either in South Africa and elsewhere in the world. For it is not human to commit such injustices. But I believe when people are rallied against along racial lines or ethnic lines, and when we are convinced by leaders whose intentions is to exploit the differences among people, the human race will always go towards an adversarial path, which is a recipe for disaster. So I took it upon myself as a young person like you to say, I will not stand and idle when there are injustices in our communities. I'm going to do what I can to rise and speak against such injustices like the generations before Mandela and the generations of Mandela have done. It is through their resilience that I'm drawing strength to continue the struggle in our country, in our continent, and beyond. For I have a vision. I myself have a vision. And I have a dream to see an Africa that is at peace with itself and the world that is at peace with itself. I hope I've done justice.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
Anna, I want to stand up.
As you mentioned, you said that Africa is often characterized as being a conflictive and poor continent. So how do you fight the stigmatization, and how do you prove to the world that your continent represents much more than violence and underdevelopment?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And it's interesting because as much as it is currently characterized by violence and underdevelopment, we still find a lot of Western powers being interested in our African continent. And in fact, that's where they get majority of the gold from. There we have Anglo-American mining companies in South Africa exploiting our natural resources. And in fact, one of the driving forces behind the conflict in Democratic Republic of Congo is because of the natural resources that are found in that particular country. Each and every Western power, Belgium, France, America, and even some of the African countries want the peace of Congo because the country is very rich with natural resources. And in fact, when France wanted to invade and remove Libya, the contributing factors to that was because of the oil reserve that were within that particular country. And that is why they were so interested in that country. So don't be confused by their tendencies to say Africa is only about conflict, diseases, violence. No, there are resources. That is why people are currently fighting. And people are fighting because they are being supported by the Western power so that they can divide the African people in order for them to exploit the resources. And we have so much diversity. Africa is one of the most beautiful continents I've ever been. And I invite you to come and visit as well. One day.
Love to. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for your questions. On behalf of the RNS community, I'd like to thank Madiba for taking time out of his busy schedule to be here today. We're honored with your presence, your enthusiasm and knowledge, and your optimism and commitment for a better future. Thank you.